Really cool.
Nice house.
Yeah, nice house.
I mean, you know.
Love sweat and tears in that one.
I know it looks like it.
Yeah.
How's the name?
I wouldn't mind having that.
Anytime you're ready.
Okay, well, I will call the special meeting and work session of the Village Board of Trustees to order and ask everyone to rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I have Katie's going to join
Okay.
on the meeting, so in case you.
So the first order of business and the special meeting part is appointment of a village clerk treasurer. As you probably have heard, Brenda Giselnik, after how many years, Larry?
15.
15 years as the village clerk treasurer, is stepping down at the end of November. So we wanted to be able to appoint someone, have some overlap. So Brenda can share all the secrets. And so we've been interviewing candidates. We had 4 finalists. And I'm happy to say that we found someone we're very excited about. Katie, how do you pronounce your last name, Katie?
Bugna.
Bugna, okay. We'll learn that maybe tonight. So Katie Bugna stood out as an excellent candidate. Combination of experience, education, and I think the most was the attitude and the excitement for the job. So we're super excited to appoint Katie tonight. Larry, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, it was a pleasure meeting her, and we had a good group of candidates, and Katie stood out. So looking forward to working with her.
I think the nice thing for me as a former auditor myself was Katie actually audited the Village of Irvington. So she's not unfamiliar with our books and records. So that's all good. I don't know if anybody else had anything they wanted to say. Otherwise, I will go ahead and put the brand appointment.
She already knows about Joe? No, we haven't told her about Joe. We wanted her to come work
Yeah,
here.
we have to appoint her first, and we'll tell her about you. Resolved to appoint Katie Bugna to the position of clerk treasurer effective November 2nd, 2022, with the term of office to begin December 5th, 2022, ending December 2nd, 2024, at an annual salary of $140,000. I'll make the motion if I can have a second.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Well, congratulations, Katie.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So I guess we'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Yes.
Excellent, excellent.
Thank you.
Well, we're happy to have you on board.
Yeah, looking forward
Thank
to
you.
working with you.
I'm happy to be part of the team.
Excellent. It's almost budget season.
Blink of an eye.
All righty. Have a good night, and thank you.
Thank you. You too.
Well, the other item on the agenda is the work session item, which is a report on deer from the Irvington Woods Committee. I know we're trying to stall a little bit for time so Mitch can join us. He had a prior engagement, but he's going to be joining us on Zoom, so he doesn't have to waste the commuting time to get here. This was a item that I believe the Irvington Woods Committee were the ones that said we wanted to look at this and look for possible solutions, and then asked if they could present their findings as well as their potential solution to the Board of Trustees. So I think for us, the 4 of us, we're all ears. I think that for me, I think the problems are pretty well understood. I think it's the solutions that to me have been difficult. So I am anxious to hear both what you found and what you think the way forward is. So.
Yeah, I would just add that I think it's sort of unique that this committee is made up not only of incredible village resident volunteers, but experts as well in Peter and CJ, who availed themselves of a lot of experts. So what we're going to hear today is a combination not just of research done by an incredible group of resident volunteers, but also by experts who are experienced in the woods. With that said, I have a phone call I've got to take in the back. I've heard the beginning of this presentation. I just have to call a patient back. Excuse me.
We're an all-purpose team.
Did you take the call from me?
I don't know if you'd like what I
Should show up here.
Yeah, I'll start.
You click on the notification.
You heard, man.
And how long do you have the total?
3 hours and 15 minutes. Just keep it on the break.
Just kidding.
We want everybody to be heard. That we have
All the
something
time
to
you
say.
need.
All the time you need.
Yeah.
We appreciate that because this has obviously been a very difficult topic.
We have to hear the reindeer out.
Right. Yeah, with reindeer season coming. It's not a great segue.
The Yankee game will take at least 4.5 hours tonight, I can guarantee that. So.
So I'll give you a little background while we wait for Dr. Lonke and Mitch. Dr. Lonke knows most of this. Over a year ago, the Woods Committee, which has really become such an amazing asset to the Recreation and Parks Department, they took on two projects. One was to simplify and redo the mapping of the Irvington Woods, which had kind of become outdated, and a lot of the things that were up got grown over, knocked out, knocked down. So volunteers, along with Peter and CJ, have pretty much redone the whole map of the Irvington Woods. It's simpler. It'll make it easier for everyone. We'll make new flyers. We'll post it everywhere. We should be releasing that very soon, but it was a real intense project, but we're done with it basically, and the public will get a chance to experience that. The other topic became the issue of deer, and we formed a deer subcommittee, which I was more than happy to stay way in the background on in the beginning, because I wasn't sure where we would go with this. And I will tell you, going in, the reason I did not want to take too big of a lead on it is I don't think I could ever have seen myself thinking that culling deer would be something I could ever personally support. I just didn't think I could. I've joked for many years, the only living creature I could hurt are Canadian geese. And that's because they've made my entire 26 years miserable. But the deer were tough, and although I knew it was a big problem, I just never thought that culling would be something I could come to terms with. Well, after listening to this group and being part of a lot of discussions and meeting with the Westchester County expert, Dan Atchison, and listening to all of these tremendous people behind me, it became clear that the deer were a major problem, even more than I ever thought. And there is no easy solution. And every time I was hoping they were going to come up with an easy solution, it kept coming back to there really isn't one. Because we found through a survey we did, which you'll hear about later, that residents' homes and property are taking tremendous beatings from the deer, thousands and thousands of dollars of damage, fencing, trying to find things they won't eat, and every time you hear they don't eat it, next day you hear they ate it. So it was a real tough thing to get to the point where we are. You're going to hear about a pilot proposal we would like to make to the board, which we know will require public input. We're prepared to come back at your calling if you feel what we put in front of you tonight is worthy, and answer questions. We know the public has to have a say. I was part of the meetings when people from Hastings came into this room and started screaming at the village board over something they weren't even going to do in the first place. It's a very sensitive topic, but every person we've talked to in higher places who've had to make decisions have told us, if you think it's what's the best thing for your community, you have to be willing to stand up, present your case, and see what happens. And I think this group is ready to do that. So Nikki Coddington's going to take it from here. She'll tell you a little bit more about the work that's going on. CJ and Peter will add a lot of their professional opinions. And then I think pretty much everyone that's on the committee will add something to it, because everyone, I think, has a little bit different way of coming at this. So I thank you for listening. It should be an interesting presentation. And I will tell you that I 100% support the request that will be in front of you tonight. So thank you. Nikki?
Jump here.
Anywhere, yeah.
Thanks, and thanks for the opportunity for us to present our work. I'd like to introduce the members of the committee, but maybe I should wait until trustee Bard has joined us.
It's going to be probably 15 minutes before he
okay.
joins
Well,
from his estimate.
I'll do that later then.
Also, he's gonna watch, I think, right? He said he's gonna watch.
You can watch it
He's
again.
gonna watch it, so.
Catch up and watch.
Yeah, he'll couch himself up.
All right. So how we're going to approach this is the draft outline that you have, which we made as an outline so you wouldn't have to plow through a 30-page report. You're welcome. It starts with the definition, the definition of the problem, and I'm going to take you through that a little bit, and then and Charlotte Binns is going to particularly describe her survey that she conducted of village residents earlier this year, and then we're going to switch over to CJ, who's going to do a presentation, a PowerPoint presentation, which illustrates visually what the problem is. Then it'll go back to me for, to the outline that you have to talk about the overview of the pilot program that we are recommending, and then what will likely happen if we do nothing, and evidence that supports that the deer management plan that we propose would likely be effective, and then we can open up to additional comments from other members of the committee who would like to present their input and from their experience. And as Joe said, this committee has done a lot of work based on prior deer studies by meeting with Dan Aitchison, the county's deer management expert, looking at what other communities have done. And we base this, I'd like to really stress this, we base this on the community forest management plan that the village had done with Miguel Barrios last year based on the grant that we got, the forest grant that we got from the DEC. So this is all science-based, data-based, and we hope we'll show we'll connect the dots and show the connections. So does that sound okay? Okay. So the problem definition. As many of you who have lived here for a while have observed, the woods have changed. There is no longer a native understory in many parts of the woods. And the problem is that if that continues, we have a potentially permanent loss of the native seed bank for the hardwood trees and shrubs and wildflowers, all native plants that everything in the ecosystem, in the native ecosystem, depends on, including in particular songbirds and important pollinators. And the more that we lose the trees because there is no understory of saplings to replace them, the more there is disturbance and colonization by invasive plants and insects. And it's kind of a spiraling, downward spiral. This potentially threatens the important ecosystem services provided by healthy forests, including stormwater and carbon dioxide, important in our fight against climate change. Disturbance by invasive plants and insects, including, as well as ticks and tick-borne diseases. Large numbers of urban residents report significant impacts from deer. And Charlotte, would you like to jump in on that briefly?
Hi. So we have an extensive spreadsheet of responses to the survey. You guys probably saw go around. And I have a summary of it here, which I can pass around. But there were 615, I believe, responses to the survey, which is pretty good, right? Good percentage of the town. More than 75% of residents say they see deer daily or multiple times a week. With regard to the question of have the deer impacted your plantings on your property and what you choose to plant? Out of 614 responses, 98 people said no, 516 said yes, and 212 of those responded emphatically, often all caps, with stories of continually destroyed gardens. A handful responded not applicable because they live in the village and don't have gardens, and a few felt strongly that the deer can eat what they want. But many say that they have tried everything in terms of deer-resistant strategies, sprays, whatnot, and it just isn't effective. They've given up, and the deer eat all the deer-proof plants, which is really a shame, particularly with regard to ecological impact and pollinator pathway plants. So, and then there was another question, have the deer impacted you or your family's health and finances? Have you found many ticks in your property, incurred expenses? Please describe. 150 people referenced expenses, some specifying hundreds, thousands, and tens of thousands in annual costs for things like fencing, wasted plantings, tens of thousands over years. Some of this conflated with tick cost, which is not entirely deer caused, but many are just plantings that get eaten, and they just every time. One person points out that they're responsible for mitigating erosion on a hill, and that's just impossible when the deer eat everything. 43 referenced having Lyme disease or tick-borne illnesses. And many people are very stressed about the ticks. That is overwhelmingly clear. And that separately, I think we could do a campaign of education around tick prevention. And many times that number of people often see and fret about ticks. A number of people point out that mice and other rodents are more of a vector than deer, which I understand to be true. Many people experience significant and regular deer scat on their lawns and are concerned about health hazards and feel they barely use their yards because of that concern. And maybe a dozen people have had referenced collisions with deer on the road. And then the last question is an open comment, and there's very interesting variety of comments on here. I encourage you to read them. Some of them are incredibly articulate on the problems of the forest and the impact on our ecosystem. So I'll pass this around, and that's it for me.
Thanks, Shirley. So now, CJ, if we could go to your PowerPoint, which would give a visual details of the situation.
Been a lifelong Zoomer, but I need a little bit of patience as I cue this for the slideshow. So.
Well, CJ, while he's doing that, I do want to remind you, the board, of just a few things. Over the past few years, we have removed between 4,000 and 5,000 barberry shrubs covering over 2 acres of property in the Irvington Woods Park. We've planted over 1,350 trees and shrubs through the Saratoga Nursery and the DEC tree planting program dating back from 2020. We've installed over 22 deer exclosures in the Irvington Woods Park and have the 8 fenced educational gardens. You can see it's no longer just a little place up off a mountain road. There is much going on, much still to be done. So yours.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Nikki. Thank you, board. Thank you, Mayor. So we're going to walk you through 12 slides that kind of visualize the Irvington Woods Committee's deer management plan. And so our first slide is kind of showing an example of what a wooded area in northern Westchester should look like. The image on the left, it comes from a deer exclosure in Bedford, Westchester. And on the right, this is a current state of our wooded understory. So you can see a clear lack of any regeneration of hardwoods or shrubs or herbaceous plants that are kind of going to be the main pollinators for our bees, wasps, and beetles. And so building on this work, this looks at a lot of different case studies, builds on the great work that Miguel did, builds on the great work and advisorship that Dan Atchison has done, who's the senior curator for wildlife for Westchester County, Parks and Recreation and Conservation. And so again, this is kind of showing on the left, the two images come from the East Irvington Nature Preserve. And so you can see how their forest canopy is a bit different from ours. Theirs is mostly 0 to 25%. There's a lot of open space for light to hit that forest floor. And as a result, you're seeing this vegetative growth. And that's not good growth, that's all Japanese silkgrass. And then compared to our forest canopy, which has a pretty dense canopy, which is protecting us to some degree, which is 75 to 100%. So it's very densely shaded, it's very hard for these invasives to take hold. However, because of the dense deer browsing that we're experiencing, that we've been experiencing for quite some time in Irvington and other areas, there's a lack of any succession, so any type of reemergence of trees or shrubs. And so under current management and conditions, should a big storm come, the understory of our woods in a few years could look exactly like the East Irvington Nature Preserve, which would make our current invasive cleanups and management systems potentially kind of a moot point. We wouldn't be able to have the kind of success that we're having now. So in image 3, this is just showing, again, in the heart of the woods, we've been spared some big storms, but this is an American beech that has come down. And in the left image, you can see the silkgrass coming up. And again, we're pretty lucky because a lot of the invasive pressure is only on the boundary points of the Irvington Woods Park, such as the reservoir, the sawmill, and parts by Marshall's Pond. And as Joe brought up, our Japanese barberry and other invasive removal programs like the Vine Squad and the Green Policy Task Force, all different kind of conglomerates of Irvington and different folks in the village, from students to seniors to working professionals, have been really coming out especially in the last 2 years, in real strong waves to help us manage the different invasive pressures. But as mentioned in the previous slide, if under current conditions, if we're not able to control the deer at their current levels, then having this become more of a routine is looking likely. So with that said, I'd like to bring up Peter, based on Peter's experience being in the woods as well. What invasive pressures have you seen kind of throughout your stewardship of Irvington Woods Park?
Peter, why don't you introduce yourself? I'm not sure everyone knows
Sure.
you.
My name is Peter Strom. I'm the owner of Stromport LLC and a certified arborist and the village tree officer for Sleepy Hollow. Basically, the age of the forest, as with a lot of the trees in the area, is very old. We're at the point where typically those trees will be dying out and we basically have nothing that we can replace them with. There aren't young trees growing, there aren't baby trees growing, and there isn't really a seed bank that we can count on. And the cost to go in and actually replant the forest is impossible. Fencing is unrealistic. There really is no way for us to be good land stewards without bringing the population of deer into balance. We're losing the climate resiliency in our landscape. When I meet with residential customers, the first question is, will the deer eat this? And that list is getting increasingly small. And when I talk to other gardeners, land care professionals, I mention the things that the deer browse and eat in Irvington, and they're astonished. They're eating ferns, they're eating plants that are partially toxic, and they basically have run out of things to eat, so they're eating everything. They can eat about 7 to 10 pounds of foliage a day, and with these population numbers, we don't even have enough things for them to eat, period.
And they don't eat the invasives.
They do not eat invasives.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, thank you, Peter.
There's gonna be geese, right, John?
They have honeybees. So continuing, and the pressure that deer browse has on the plants, especially kind of the adolescent trees that might have made it past the browsing height of deer browse for that spring, summer, fall. then they become kind of susceptible to buck rub. And so that's when the male bucks will rub their antlers against a juvenile tree, which basically girdles the tree. So it kind of strips the key of it strips the tree of its cambium layer and can't get the nutrients it needs. So the stressors are year-round from the browsing during the growing season, and then during the dormancy period of that trees would be sleeping or getting kind of girdled through the buck rub. And so this is an image that kind of goes over our current model and management systems that use exclosures. So and this is kind of we did a lot of hard thinking and brainstorming around kind of like, well, what are our current solutions based on what we have? And we can prove that exclosures work. They've worked for our educational gardens, and then they're working in small sectors of the Irvington Woods Park. However, of the over 22 exclosures that we have, they represent less than 1 acre of property of the 232 acres of property that are the Irvington Woods Park.
So why does Peter say that fencing doesn't work when exclosures show that fencing can work?
Well, at a very large scale.
We
At the
can't
scale
fence the whole
required.
woods.
I think he said it was impractical, not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
At the scale required.
Just to give you a little example, what you see fenced there, that we basically, CJ, Peter, and people did, the 22 enclosures we put in the woods, we did for a few $1,000s. We got a price from our fence company who did the educational gardens to do the same areas, and it would have been $30,000.
That's 1%.
Plus, they have to be maintained.
Yes.
Plus,
Right.
absolutely, Mark.
Right, I guess it only takes one fence to go down, and then.
This exact conversation Larry and I had today, why it's working right now with the small numbers we have, is because if we get a call, a part of one of them is down, CJ and kids are out there, we're volunteers and repairing it the next day.
So this again just kind of shows the scope of our current management systems that are working, but when scaled kind of out at the macro level, you can see kind of the real crux of the challenge. And then we did a lot of hard thinking too. Dan Atchinson, who spent about half a day with me in the woods walking around, led us to the question, well, is it deer or is it the soil? And so that was a great question. And I think this research has allowed us to ask better questions of ourselves and better questions of the woods. And in return, we've gotten a clearer picture. And so Cornell, through Jean Bontal and Richard Schneiderbeck, they were they work with the Cornell Waste Management Institute and are the main chief soil testers. And so Jean, we've had a relationship with in the past with the Pollinator Roadside Project, with the DOT. She came out this past summer, it was actually really in June, to test 7 areas within the Irvington Woods Park. And the soil samples show that all 7 sites came back as scoring in the very high category, 80% to 100%. So we were within those margins. So
To the good.
Yes. So our soil that based on the quality index indicates that we should be having optimum growth from the soil output. However, we're not seeing that, and which has led us to what we're bringing in front of you today. And with the PDF that will be shared, there are hyperlinks to all of the other sub reports too. And so this brings us back to kind of why look at kind of the restoration for the woods and what happens and the impact, and our big kind of empirical evidence goes back to the deer exclosures, where in the Irvington at the O'Hare Nature Center, where since they went up in 2017, and this is showing that when you eliminate the white-tailed deer, this is the kind of results that you were able to see within a few years with pollinator regeneration. So from our 2021, it was 2020 research project with Cornell Waste Management Institute and the Department of Transportation, we observed over 2,000, we had over 2,404 observations, and of those, we identified over 150 species. And that's in 8 enclosed gardens that would make up kind of someone a little bit bigger than kind of the contemporary Irvington property. And that's amazing just to see that type of biodiversity exist within a very small parcel of land. And so you can see the dynamics of when you eliminate or cut down the pressure of white-tailed deer, the quick response you're able to get with pollinators, and then from the more pollinators we have, the more songbirds we're able to get. And so it's kind of this positive cascade effect. And that's what kind of we're trying to illustrate in these slides here, is that a lot of our decision making has been based on questions and our own data collection. And so from documenting the pollinators in our native gardens and how the native plants are benefiting, and also how these exclosures work once you eliminate a white-tailed deer. And so
a quick question, because this is what I've been wondering about. And, you know, there's always a discussion of seed viability, and there's a whole range of viability of species, you know, depending, whatever. I've always heard that, you know, by rule of thumb, it's 15 to 20 years as a seed bank. And obviously we've had a deer problem for maybe not the density, certainly for the last 10 years, let's be friendly, but maybe it's 15 years where we've had significant over 20 deer per square mile, whatever the impact is. But so I'm wondering now if you're seeing signs of that in the exclosures, if you're seeing that certain species are not regenerating, or are there certain locations where they don't regenerate, but in others do, you know, that kind of thing.
that's a great question, Mr. Gillen. So would say sassafras has been a species that we've seen to have good resilience once there's an exclosure that goes up in densely shaded areas within the Irvington Woods Park. Whereas the maples and the oaks are slower, but at least we're seeing the seedlings able to withstand one full growing season. They're not growing 3 to 4 to 5 inches like the sassafras are per growing season, but they're there.
And for the herbaceous guys and, you know, ephemerals and spring ephemerals, are there still viable seeds in the soil, or are they past their prime?
That based on my observations, I haven't seen too much. Peter?
Yeah, I wouldn't say there's a high likelihood of your spring ephemerals coming up. It's basically white snakeroot is the predominant herbaceous plant, and that's toxic to deer. That's the only reason it's still standing.
And that's part of the problem of if nothing is done, some of that seed bank will never, it'll just lose its viability and it won't come back.
Right, if it hasn't already, is my
If it
was my
hasn't
concern.
already.
Certain percentage, right?
you
I mean,
know-
Yeah.
you know, like any seed, you say it's only viable for 5 years, but there's a certain percentage that's viable much longer than that. But it's a decreasing curve. So that's, you know, what in my mind, some of the urgency is, we've seen this for a long time, and the urgency is, you all mentioned it already, which is, you know, the effective cost of regeneration if you have to plant it from scratch. You know, it becomes another, is that even doable at some point?
Yeah.
So anyway, sorry, Jay.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's a great question. So that brings us to kind of keeping informed with our documentation. So this past summer we installed in June, based on really the black bear, but then we then turned it into this larger project. But 5 wildlife cameras that were set up in different parts of the Irvington Woods Park to just monitor and understand kind of the large wildlife that calls the Irvington Woods Park home. And so some of the data that came back from us was that the deer were most active during the day. We basically were able I get a deer on camera every single day that the cameras are up in all different locations of the Irvington Woods Park, showing that the diversity and density of their browse. In the top left graphic shows kind of the density of coyote versus black bear versus white-tailed deer, and you can see kind of the imbalance. And so again, a big part of our work was trying to look at all corners and all avenues to again, try to ask better questions of ourselves and for the report to then present to you all. And so this is the statistics from the Irvington Police Department, calls for service regarding deer. And so you can see the increase outside of the COVID year, 2019, the police calls for deer in Irvington.
And 2022 isn't even over yet.
Correct, yeah. And so this visualizes Charlotte Binns's great survey, which kind of looks at the deer issue, not so much from the Irvington Woods Park's perspective, but from the community's perspective, and kind of the costs that deer are having on home ownership and ornamental plants, and the value of loss that residents are experiencing and how they're feeling. Charlotte, is there anything else you'd want to add?
You know, it's from what I've seen from over the years, the biggest problem is for homeownership is, you know, without being able to have a reliable set of planting material, you end up with, you know, as mentioned, there's erosion issues, there's shade, cooling issues for the, you know, for the summertime. There's privacy issues since we are pretty densely built around here. And more than that, but you know, there's a lot of quality of life issues that come out very quickly. And anecdotally, I have to say that I've been shocked with what I've seen over the last couple of years with the browse against ferns. Someone mentioned the fern browse, and things that you know, you'd say they never eat it. Well, I think the only thing that I've seen that hasn't been eaten so far this year or tried is Andromeda, and by that I mean the woody shrub, Pieris japonica, and then a bunch of species of magnolia. Doesn't seem to be touched. So that gives a little bit of, you know, but I'm sure that's going to be tested. You know, in my own yard, I saw them starting to eat peonies. So that's kind of a first time in 25 years kind of thing.
We've been talking a lot about the density of the deer. In the county study back in 2007 and 8, they came out with figures that said that there was 25 deer per square mile in 2007 and 8. And we know we have more deer than we did back then. So the numbers we're dealing with are overwhelming. And then the other part that I want to just add on to Charlotte's is I had no idea the impact they were having on homeowners until the report came out and I had a chance to see that. You know, I just assumed it was our problem when we had to deal with it. It was just amazing. And every time I was talking to Dr. Lonke a few weeks ago, and he had 3 in his backyard. So it's everywhere, and it's having an impact on our residents.
I would say the residents seem overwhelmingly in support. The very small percentage who say anything in dissent from their comments seem to not understand the implications on the other species and the rest of the ecosystem that are being taken out because of this.
Thank you.
And then this is our last slide that we conclude on for the visual presentation. So this is lifelong resident Philip Whitney. And so in 1968, you can see young Philip with his dog. And then in the background, you can see kind of the thicket into kind of the Irvington Woods Park. And then in 1989, you can still see the thicket and just get an idea that there's a real clear border between homeowner property and this real great sanctuary. And then currently, where there should be a thicket, you can see directly through the Irvington Woods Park. And to Philip's quote here, deer became very active in the early 90s, and by then the deer were ravaging the property. By 2000, they had killed many Texas shrubs. I erected the deer fence in 2006, 2008. So kind of talks about that shift in deer population and the course that we've been currently on. That concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, CJ. And I will say that, in my own observation, I lived in Irvington since 1992. We originally lived at the end of Cedar Ridge, Hillside Terrace, next to the woods, and we rarely saw deer. That was before Legend Hollow was developed, which that whole development was woods above Halsey Pond, between Halsey Pond and Cyrus Field Road. And it was around that time in the early 90s that we started to observe more deer on our property and just, on private properties in general. So, the woods the population of the deer has expanded to way beyond the carrying capacity, as it's called, of the woods. And as Charlotte said, we're concerned about the whole ecosystem. So it's not just the trees and the ecosystem services they provide for us humans, but all the other species of insects and birds and so on that depend on the trees and the understory and the replacement of trees into a healthy forest ecosystem. Doug Talamy, scientist, for example, he's a big promoter of the backyard biodiversity movement and pollinator gardens. He's pointed out that an oak, the oak species, and there are a variety of oaks, can support up to about 557 species of caterpillars, basically butterflies and moths, which birds depend on to feed their young. If you have a forest, and then maples, native maples, and so on, birches, willows, all support great numbers. If the forest loses those native species that these insects depend on, that the birds depend on for their reproduction, you're just losing whole swaths of other species, and so I want to say to the people who have compassion for the deer, we have compassion for the deer, and we also have compassion for all the other species that are depending on this ecosystem in the woods. And in fact, the deer themselves are not particularly healthy in this condition. Many of them are hungry, especially in winter. So that brings us to the pilot program, the deer management pilot program, in which we recommend a safe and cost-effective one-year pilot program that involves the use of culling by an approved professional hunter who specializes in this approach and this type of program. In fact, they're, in the ones that we've spoken with, they're called consultants because they go beyond hunting. It's their expertise in the issue of deer management goes beyond just hunting, and it's not the same as like a recreational hunting. And culling means bow hunting exclusively at specific scheduled times and locations from tree stands only, and this also is a safety issue because it protects humans and other species from hunting activities. So it would only be from tree stands at scheduled times and locations. So you're not going to have a bunch of hunters roaming through the woods. They would be specifically qualified to do this, and we would collect data and assess the data and review the results. And we have ruled out other methods such as immunocontraception as ineffective. what will likely happen if we do nothing to manage the current deer population. As we've touched on before, conditions will worsen. The canopy will open, there'll be sort of monocrops of those invasive species like Japanese stilt grass that don't support more than a few native species of insects and birds, if any. The canopy will continue to open. There will be no tree seedlings to replace the mature native trees that fall. And so gradually you will lose, it'll be a cascading effect where you will lose the forest. And as we mentioned before, some of the seed bank just will not regenerate. As CJ mentioned earlier, among other evidence, the educational gardens show the effects of both plant and wildlife diversity when you remove or reduce deer from browse. There are other communities in the region, programs, Ward Pound Ridge, Muscoot Farm, T-Town, what's the one in the Bronx? Fordham University, that have undertaken similar deer management measures. So that's, and below are our references. And we would propose that at the public, should you as a board decide to pursue this route and present it to the public, that we would bring in experts like Dan Aitchison and the New York State DEC deer expert and others to answer your questions and the public's questions.
So Nikki, immediate questions, only one hunter? And what is one hunter enough? What's the time frame we're talking about? I mean, how many days of hunting might be required? And I saw a target number of density. But what does that mean in the real world? In other words, what's our current density? So in the woods. So what are we talking about? How many females would have to be targeted in the first year to reach anything close to this density?
CJ?
I'll take that. I don't think we can answer that, Mark, right now, because we're hoping that you'll at least give us the green light to then come back. We talked to a lot of people, but we've not engaged direct conversation with the individual that's been recommended to us. So we need to bring him in and find out his thoughts on that before we can properly tell you how big an area, when, and what. CJ and I were discussing prior to the meeting, we'd likely have to do it, we'd like to do it early in the morning before the park even opens and get a couple hours in there. But we don't really have those answers yet, because if you were to say to us tonight, look, guys, it's not something we can get behind, we don't want to spend more effort. As you could see, what went into getting us here tonight. If you tell us you want more and you'd like us to talk with the public, we'll have all that information for you at the next meeting. We'll be real specific. We'll be much more specific.
Yeah, I think.
We can't even really put a number on it for you right now.
Well, I don't even know if we have a number for the deer population effectively.
Well, again, if you look back and you go by what the county numbers are, even if you use what they said was going on in 2008, that's still too many. And there's more now. I don't know. I can't imagine to be any individual who's been around since 2008 in Irvington.
Right, Joe, you don't have to sell me on this. I'm just making a point.
I know. So
that there's got to be a baseline, otherwise you can't reference the change.
we can talk to Dan Atchison in the county about helping us to figure out a way to get that number.
Right, I think that's, I mean, I don't know what the best way is. Sometimes there's aerial surveys, sometimes there's camera surveys, and everything's extrapolated no matter what you do.
Right.
But my concern is that, like you're saying, 25 per square mile was back, 10 years ago or over 10 years ago, and that was way beyond capacity.
Yep.
So I was also wondering, because this is leading me to questioning like the ongoing program at Ward's Pound Ridge, I thought they had more than one hunter operating there when they were doing it. So that's what I'm wondering what their experience was.
Yeah, again, we've talked to them, but I don't know. Our consultant may say the best way to attack this is with one individual on this many days at this many hours, or he might come back to us and say, I think we need to do this as, go ahead, CJ.
Sure. So Dan Atchison, who manages the Mountain Ridge, and those are through volunteer hunters. And
Do you want to start here?
sure. Dan's recommendations to us based on the geographical location of the Irvington Woods Park, its density around it, said that the safest protocol for handling our deer pressure would be through one specialized hunter. That hunter was recommended who manages just the T-Town property and Fordham University's property, and that's through culling.
Okay, so they're not doing, okay, because I know that the Pound Ridge one, they had a certain number of hunters come in. I don't know what the protocol was or anything, but I know it was more than just one. So.
Correct.
There's a difference, Mark. There's a difference between volunteer hunters and expert cullers.
Well, I understand
Strategy
that.
is at level of
But deer also get very familiar with the killing grounds. So
Yes,
I assume we would let the expert deal with that.
yeah. And Ward Pound Ridge is a lot bigger than.
Yeah, our woods are scary to think of volunteers being allowed in there.
I'm not saying that.
Yeah,
there
no,
should be
I mean, for the
volunteers,
public, I just want,
Yeah.
that's why we agree with Dan that we have to pursue it from a professional standpoint. And you're right, they do get to know who's stalking them. Walk in Matheson with me with a bunch of geese and see who they run from.
Well, the whole idea here is we are asking for a pilot.
Right.
We're not asking for the program.
But
It's
you
one of
gotta
the
have
questions-
Program
metrics.
will have all the answers to your questions
No, I don't
because of
understand.
having a pilot.
A pilot has to have numbers anyways. You can't just
Of
go
course
into a
it does.
pilot. You have to have a framework, you have to have the baseline, you have to have analysis.
Yeah.
It just happens to be that you might be only, you're throwing possibly, one hunter at it and saying, how effective is this? And then you understand how you have to scale it,
Mhm.
but you still have numbers and data that you have to refer to.
We don't-
I think to me, my question, I mean, I think that is there a deer problem is an absolute no-brainer that there's a deer problem. Like they literally come up to my door and eat potted plants off. Like we have two dogs going nuts on the other side of the door. They don't care. And I've had up to 14 on my front yard. So it's insane. Where like when I was a kid growing up here, if you saw a deer, you'd talk about it for a week because it was such a rare occurrence. So what's changed in the last 40 years has been unbelievable. So I don't think that there's any question that when we talked about this in 2009, the time before I was actually mayor, I was just a trustee. The reason we didn't do anything was because the backlash was severe. And I know that your survey didn't have that, but we'll have we might have to have it up in the theater because there's going to be 100 people there, throwing, blood on us because the people go absolutely nuts with this topic. So I just want everyone prepared. It's not that we're saying we're not going to do anything because of that. I mean, we're fine with getting booed and called every name in the book, as you all know from recent events. But it's not going to be everyone's not going to be here cheering us and what great job you guys are doing. So this is going to be a slog. So for me to get comfortable with that, I'd love to see some data on the Fordham one, similar, because like as of 2009, New York State DEC had never approved a cull before, at least what Hastings was trying to do. So I'd love to get the updated data in the last 10 years on that. I know they were trying to do bolt, and they were doing it in a kind of a strange way that was supposedly more humane and less dangerous to surrounding people. But my skepticism comes from a cull in the Irvington Woods because to me, like every time I read about the compensating rebound, there was I think it was Stevens Point, Wisconsin, has been doing this for 17 years, and they have the data. And after 17 years, their population had gone down within the margin of error. So they did this every year for 17 years, and their population was the same. So there's to me, I need to be convinced that it seems like complete common sense. If we find out we have 600 deer, we kill 100 of them, we're gonna have a lot less deer. But what happens is that from again, Dr. Google, who I consulted. The deer compensate. There's a reason there's so many deer is they're great at compensating for this. So they, instead of having one fawn, they have triplets. It's a really hard problem. So to me, I need to see before, I have blood thrown on me walking out of my house in the morning. I need to see that here's hard data that Fordham used to have 600 deer And 10 years or 6 years later, after doing it, they only have 39 still because they culled them all. Like, I think we need to have really, really good data. That is going to be like almost irrefutable. Like, because I think the fact that there's a problem is irrefutable. So now it's just what the solution is. I think we saw what poor Hastings went through with their, immunocontraception proved to us that was not the idea. Fencing, you can't fence in woods. You can fence in parks. To me, there aren't a lot of other, creative solutions on this. You can't trap the deer and bring them to Canada. There's just not a lot of solutions that are cost effective or effective. So I think we just have to, I just have to be convinced that culling is actually effective and not just, the deer are just, better adapted to living in the Irvington woods than we are to getting rid of them. So that's probably my big takeaway. So
Very fair.
because again, we're gonna face a lot of opposition.
And Brian, just so you know, when the committee first took this on, your words that you started with was the first warning I gave this group. Because I think you and I were probably the only two that were at that meeting at the time, maybe Nikki. But they destroyed the board.
Yeah.
And
we weren't doing anything. We were just listening to what Hastings was doing.
And when CJ and I met with Dan, we said, well, how do we prepare for that? He says, there's no preparing, it's gonna happen.
Yeah.
He said, the minute it gets out that you've talked to your board, everyone's going to be asking, coming, and preparing to try to tear you down.
Yeah, and it's not even just local people.
Right,
It's
exactly.
national.
And we asked him, well, what did you do? He said, we were lucky enough to have a strong commissioner of Parks and Recreation. We stood our ground, we took our hits. Eventually, those people went away. We came up with a solid program for the residents of Westchester, and it works in many situations. Unfortunately, their way doesn't work in ours, but it's not gonna be an easy thing.
Yeah.
That's how I started tonight. We know that, but we're willing to keep trying. You've challenged us with some good questions,
Yeah.
and we're gonna go back and work.
I mean, I do think in a lot of ways, it's not that different than recreational hunting. It's just that we don't have the area to do that.
That's right.
So to me, but again, I'm not sure how effective that's been in controlling the populations, because it seems like, the takes in New York State have continually gone up, is my understanding, and it doesn't seem to have any effect, at least not downstream. They're not all rushing back to the Catskills and the Adirondacks. It's so open there now, they're staying here. I think we just need some more data, I think is the answer. And then, because to me, with data, we can dig in and say, we're gonna try this. And I do think that, yes, you definitely need a pilot, but it's almost like the project across the street with the fire department. Yes, we can only plan on spending $1 million on the plans and the engineering, but once you do that, once we do a pilot, assuming it works, this is something you'd have to do, I think, every year in perpetuity to have it have a real effect. It's, I think that's another interesting factor. I don't think it actually will probably cost that much, that it's like prohibitively, especially not compared to like the damage it's doing. And I think you can see, a lot of ancillary benefits with the reduction in car accidents, with the reduction on plants on my doorstep being eaten. I think there's a lot of ways to justify it. But the key thing is, does it really work? What's word poundages? What are all the local ones? Because I think too, if you just Google, you get a lot of people pushing a certain point of view either way. So I'd like to hear from kind of experts, and we have some data on people that have done this locally. So I think that'll be the key for me.
I also urge all committee members, stay off Facebook.
So the thing that I've always been concerned about is, in any of these projects, Irvington isn't an island, so, ultimately, if this works, if the pilot works, if we start moving forward, we're gonna have to try to engage some of the neighbor municipalities to try to take care of their woods as well. Otherwise, the influx, the kind of the normal dynamics, it's kind of bows in or something.
Yep.
But just if there's open environmental space, the deer are gonna come into it.
With all due respect, they're looking to us.
Well, fine, then that says it even more, that we should get moving and then have everyone follow us. If that's
Even some private partnerships with like country clubs and things like that, because their geese are deer. I mean, the deer destroy country clubs. So, I know Ardsley, when we were talking about this in 2010, said, hey, we'd be happy to host any kind of bow hunters you want on our property. So it's not a bad idea maybe to expand this to anyone who's interested. And, maybe Elmsford is like they have the woods kind of in between us, maybe, I don't know, I'd be happy to, if we find out that this is indeed effective, happy to reach out and see if anybody wants to join us.
So just for everyone, would it be fair to ask the board to give us until possibly right before the holidays to come back with some of the information they've requested so that they'll have a chance to look it over, and possibly after the first of the year, we could be ready for another discussion. It gives us a couple of months to do our work, to keep looking.
Why don't we shoot maybe for the first work session, or the work session in January then?
But we'll get to the info before that,
Sure.
and then we could plan on coming back. But also I just want to make sure, because some of these other members in the room have worked very hard. Zoe, I know you've been dealing with this for years. If either of you, or any of you behind me, I don't know who's here, would like to place a comment, please do
Sorry,
so.
Leslie.
You could turn around.
Yeah, not with his back, not with his back.
For Charlotte, but they, what?
I thought you were hoping for a clear timeline.
Yes.
Can I just say one thing here is that unfortunately or fortunately for everyone, end of November is the end of my lifetime up here at the dais.
But you'll be a resident, you can come on board and comment.
No, but.
That's true.
More poignant.
But you-
I don't think we could get the data and be confident to stand behind it. I think once we gather it, we've
We
got
can
it.
try.
Well, I'm not saying we can't if you're the chair.
Certainly try.
Yeah.
Zoe, did you want to say anything? Because the meeting kind of got away from me, so I didn't get a chance to give you guys an opportunity to speak.
Only to reiterate what everyone, Nikki and CJ and Peter and Charlotte have stated. Our area is out of balance and it needs our help. We've sort of, as residents, we're part of the problem. The deer have gotten out of, populations out of control, and I very much appreciate the chance to let us try to do this, to give you the information. I'm working with CJ to continue to try to get the invasives out of the woods, but it won't matter if nothing can grow. None of the natives can grow, so.
I'm guessing they didn't eat the barberries, did they, Jeff?
Oh, no.
No, but
CJ,
believe
how
it or
much
not,
time, Peter, how much time do you think we need to put the real data together?
Well, you guys can let us know, you don't have to give us an answer. If you can come back sooner, great, but to us, if we can shoot for that anyway.
I also I'm thinking, just hearing this for the first time, and I can say that I have my fair share of deer issues, including they stomped my dog and almost killed him. But yeah, he's 16 and going strong. But I guess I still, in listening to you guys, I also, in terms of data, I don't know that I understand what it looks like how many deer, are we talking about? What does that look like? I guess I need a little bit more detail around that. Are we talking they're gonna go and try to, obviously not a hunter. I don't know how many deer you can bow hunt in a day, but what does that look like, right? What does that actually look like?
Most of
Numbers.
the county volunteer, where you volunteer, you want to go hunt for them on one of their properties, they might give out 6 tags for a season. On a huge year, I believe Dan told us it was between 12 and 20, and on some years it's 6 or 8.
per hunter or total,
Per total.
So
6 tags total is all they take out?
But
that's
it's for
hunting,
that's actual hunting.
not color.
Correct. Not culling.
Yeah, so I think we'd love to hear what this looks like. To me, again, if it's 6 deer, to me, that almost common sense says it's not gonna do anything anyway, because, but it may be, we don't have any numbers, so.
CJ, did you mention that deer can reproduce at 6 months?
Yeah, so, actually, you bring up some great points, and it's not worth to go into.
Yeah, the compensating rebound, that's part of it. Apparently, they mature sexually faster.
Yeah, and so that's part of culling. You're looking at not at the bucks, but at the young does.
And that's gonna go over real well too.
And so that you're reducing the amount of births that might happen within the consecutive years.
And
that's somewhat of a newer development in the last 6 to 7 years that the DEC has recommended for
To go younger.
to go younger and specifically culling.
Yeah.
To see the rates of change faster.
So they're not targeting the bucks at all with this.
I don't know if they're not targeting the bucks at all, but the priority
Yeah.
are the upper down.
What happens with the kill?
Well, most times there's arrangements to give it to
Food banks.
food banks.
Right, so it goes through like,
Right.
If it's
Years
healthy.
ago, there was a bad experience with geese and a food bank in Nyack, which scared a lot of people. But that's what happens in most situations. There are many food banks that will accept it.
right, they have to get processed, they go to Menards or something like that, get processed and then get sold off to the food bank, right?
Yeah, given as a donation.
David, this is
I-
David Swedell.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to Brian's last point. You mentioned country clubs. I think Irvington has a number of developments where all the landscaping is part of the community development. And those guys are experiencing tremendous cost to manage their deer. And they also could potentially be partners in a culling operation. So I think your point that it would be wise of course, to get Hastings and Terry Down and et cetera involved. But I think we would have a friendly response from the boards of all of the different developments in the community because of nothing other than the amount of money they're spending on deer management.
Assume they have enough open space.
Is Rick Rizzullo 140?
Yeah.
Yes.
His exact words were, we've spent tens of thousands of dollars a year to deal with the deer problem.
And when you say open space, it's.
Wait,
not
where,
real.
I'm sorry to interrupt, where was that location that the person said they spent all that money?
140 Broadway.
No, I live at 140 Broadway, I'm on the board, so that's patently not true.
That where Rick Rizzullo is
Oh,
the
it's here
chair?
at 120.
Or is that, he's at 120. I
The
think he's at
I'm not
120.
sure what number Rick's at, but I can tell you as the chair and also as the head of the Rec and Parks Commission, those were his numbers he gave me. I honestly don't remember.
I'm just saying that I am on the board at 140, and that's not true about 140. If it's true about another property, obviously I have no
I
knowledge
think
of
it's
that.
120.
There are these small pockets in a lot of these developments where the deer reside. I know Field Point, there's just a couple corners that, Field Point is divided up with all these individual houses and the groups, and then the community itself owns the borderland property. So there's this, 20, 50 yards between a house and property line that is open, and that's where the deer hang out. On the corner of Broadway and Harriman Road, if you're going down Broadway and you turn up, there's that whole wooded hill there with the apartments way up behind. But that hill that's where they live.
Well, don't forget Columbia Nevis.
Yeah, and Columbia,
That's
it's all sprinkled around the village.
That's a huge property.
Exactly.
They live on Riverview Road pretty well.
But it doesn't take a large amount of acreage for these deer to find them. That's where
It's
10
just
or
more,
15 of them are home.
I know there's recommended, range for the arrows, and if
Yes.
something happens and you want to have,
Although
Yeah.
this system is very different, and that's, as Nikki pointed
I
out,
think when Hastings was talking about their sharpshooter, they wanted to have 1,000 feet from a house or something like that.
Yeah, so Dan Aitchison, the county deer guy, said that,
He's on.
He's actually on.
Oh, Dan is on,
He has
great.
his hand raised if you're interested.
oh, yeah, because there are, private property owners, if they meet certain conditions, can participate. So can we go to Dan?
Hey, folks, can you hear me?
Hey, Dan. Yes.
Hey, Just to answer some of the questions that were asked regarding numbers and stuff like that. Joe, when you were talking about the county's initial assessments and surveys, it was close to 90-something deer per square mile, and in the areas that they didn't survey in the periphery, it was assumed that it was 100 or more. And now that was just specifically for Ward Pound Ridge Reservation, so it was very that was a very localized study, and regionally those deer densities change, or they can be different. And what you guys are really looking at is not necessarily deer density comes into play, but you're looking at a reduction of deer impact. So different landscapes can support different numbers of deer, and that varies depending upon the habitat, geography, the food resources. So some areas can support more deer than others. So what biologists are looking at is how many deer can that landscape support and still recover. Just another thing to correct too, when it comes to how many deer can be harvested by a hunter in Westchester County, antlerless deer, there's an unlimited number that a hunter can harvest. Antlerless deer include deer without antlers, so young deer, young of the year, or does. Bucks, it's a limit of 2. And when it comes to how many deer our county program is harvesting per year, that varies as well. During our higher years in the beginning of the program, one year, for example, we harvested, I think it was like 110 deer for the program. And then eventually, especially with archery programs, you see a plateau over time where we start to level off at around 30 to 50 deer. And we were looking at different numbers of acreages, and at our highest, we were managing like 6,000 acres, or close to it. So there's a lot of thought to put into this process, and definitely some more research to do. One of the reasons why I was suggesting that singular hunter who's well versed in managing properties and has made this specialty of his outside of a program like ours is because for our type of program, we have a very large acreage, or we have a lot of land that we're managing, and there's space to accommodate more hunters. For a property like yours, it's very small and very concise, and having more people hunting deer will just increase the amount of pressure on those animals, which they'll become educated to, and therefore they'll vacate the area and find new areas of refugia. So in those particular cases, it's better to have a singular person or a smaller team that's acting very surgically to work on that landscape with those particular animals. And we've seen examples of this too down in Rye, where they had their host a hunter program, which they just ended up hosting one singular hunter, but he did very, very well on the properties that he was managing, as opposed to a larger group. It's easier to coordinate, and it's also just more specific. One other thing I want, yeah.
Were the houses and properties in Rye private?
Yeah, so the way that they worked their program was that they had this one specialized hunter, and he gained permission from the private property owners, and I believe he was able to make like one contiguous tract of properties. I'm not sure if it was broken up in between, and he was hunting in their wooded backyards.
Dan, can I just ask you, can you just run by some of the numbers you gave us in the beginning? You said the 08-09 study, so there were 100 deer per acre?
No, per square mile. It was, I don't remember the exact number, but it was like 93 or 96 or something deer per square mile. And then on the periphery, it was assumed that it could have been closer to 100. The populations were so dense in this particular area. You know, we were observing groups of 20 something, 30 something deer at a time. And in the late 90s, when we had a really severe winter, the food resources were so sparse because there were so many animals, and the snow got deep enough that we actually had a winter die-off, which you do not see in these areas.
So I just want to make sure I understand that. So it was about 640 acres in a square mile. And you said you had about 6,000 acres?
No, that was just for our program as a total. It was in between 5,000 to 6,000 acres of huntable area within 6 parks at that point in time. But the actual surveying that was being done was done at Ward Pound Ridge Reservation specifically, not including those other parcels, and that's a 4,300 acre park.
Okay. So can't do mental math, and I'm trying to talk.
Yeah.
So 4,300 acres divided by 640 is about, call it 7 rounded. So if there were 100 deer, that means there's, you know, say 700 deer, and you killed about 110. Is that the right ratio?
No, that was a particular harvest for all of the parcels that we were hunting on during that particular year. That included Ward Pound Ridge Reservation, but not just the reservation. I have the breakdown of numbers per parcel over the years that I can supply to your, to your board at another time.
That'd be great. I mean, because to me, like, you know, I'm just saying, you know, there's 7,000 deer and you kill 100. Like, does that, you know, I just, you know, again, you'll have the data on how it's affected the forests and everything, but it just doesn't seem like enough to me.
Yeah, so I mean, essentially what we've seen over time, just to kind of put everything into a nutshell, is that, you know, through the reduction of deer densities, there's been an obvious and logical reduction in deer impacts. And we have seen, you know, regenerative results, but deer harvest is not a singular silver bullet. It requires the additional, you know, forest management and, you know, invasive management that goes along with it. Deer management is just the first step to reduce the impacts on anything that's starting to grow. A good example is what we, you know, before we started to have the ash die off, when we had full canopy, we were seeing some results, and, you know, some of the invasives would come back first, such as like euonymus. Deer love to eat that, and that used to be browsed down to the ground. If anything escaped, it would mature, but anything that was small in a seedling, it almost looked like grass. It was so tiny, and that was some of the first stuff to come back, along with the beech. And over the years, like, the less desirable species would start to recover, such as beech and birch and cherry. But we weren't necessarily seeing some of the other species. But when we started to get canopy gaps, like, you know, from the ashes dying off or from the severe storms, you would start to see other things pop into there, like maple leaf viburnum. That was something that prior to the management of deer, if you even saw a maple leaf viburnum, it was impressive. And now when it can grow and where it can grow, you know, it will actually get to more of a mature type of height. But I always like to throw this in here because it is important to recognize just managing deer is not going to suddenly, you know, recover a forest in a short period of time. It does require additional work. And as someone was mentioning, there is a legacy effect, especially when the forest understory has been hammered for such a long period of time and has undergone such major impacts. that some of that seed bank is completely gone or completely degraded. One of the things about your particular parcel that I was impressed with is that you don't even have invasives in there. You don't have those large patches of barberry or other plants that are growing, and even the fern species are extremely limited. That landscape is almost completely denuded. So are deer part of the equation? Absolutely. But are there other factors at play? Yes, there definitely are, and those would need to be worked with and managed as well.
And is the mayor right that it would basically be an ongoing process, over years?
Yes, yeah. If you want to reach your end goal, this is constant management. One of the things that had been said or alluded to was the recovery of deer. The idea that once you start harvesting deer, that all of a sudden they there's this massive vacuum and other deer start to fill in their place, and they start having more and more fawns. That's not something that we've seen. One of the things that we've noticed up here, and I am going to caution you, this is somewhat anecdotal, based off of our hunter sightings in our own viewings, but there's less recruitment of fawns, and I'm not 100% sure why that is. It might have something to do with increased predation, because of bears moving into the area, or coyotes and bobcats, or a trifecta of all three. But we're seeing less fawns with the doe groups than we have in the past. But what we never saw over time was all of a sudden, does having 3 fawns or more. What can happen though, and they have done studies that have proved this, where they've had enclosures with I want to say counted a known number of deer within it, where then they reduce the number of deer within that enclosure, and the deer population on its own was able to recover within, I think it was 3 to 5 years. Keeping in mind that there was no other mortality due to car collisions, hunting, or predators, because it was all within a high fence. So on their own in a controlled environment, yes, they can recover very quickly. But in a natural environment where there is mortality due to a number of different factors, some of that maintains control. And to go back to your question, if you stop managing deer, that population will recover.
So Dan, if I can ask, given that this is will probably be an ongoing project, but we're talking about a pilot program to start, this sort of gets back into the data question. What kind of data can be collected within the year by staff that can let us know whether this program is working or not in such a short period of time?
So within a year, you're not going to learn too much. Within a year, the only information that you'd be able to collect is baseline data, which you might have already been collecting. And when I refer to baseline data, that's more along the lines of what kind of vegetation you do or you don't have, and whatever type of browse impact studies that you might implement. You'd have a tough time quantifying browse impact, because there's not much on the landscape that even exists to show browse. But you might be able to find some stuff. But I think that you could do some sort of study that would, or I should say more of an inventory with transects that would show what's there, what's present and what's not present, and quantity of presence. So you would have your vegetation studies, and then outside of that, you would only really have overall harvest and sightings, and you're not going to have a forest response in a year or even 2.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for tuning in tonight, Dan.
Sure thing.
Yeah, I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dan.
All right. Well, I think we obviously appreciate the presentation. Again, I challenge anyone to tell us there's not a deer problem. Now it's what are we going to do about it? What can we do about it? What's been successful? I think those are the questions. So appreciate it. I think we look forward to hearing some data from everyone.
So I have one other comment. I'm sorry. This is something that has been bothering me is that, you know, we've all talked about deer fencing, and I know many people, you know, have gone the route of adding deer fencing to their yards. And our code makes it pretty easy now to put up, you know, 8 foot, whether that's sufficient. That's everyone's open debate. But what is starting to concern me, I've been thinking about corridors, wildlife corridors, because these deer fences, if they go up and we start forming between contiguous properties, which I have seen, you know, you can drive on certain roads in the village and see, you know, multiple houses in a row that are all fenced up. And it really concerns me in terms of, I guess it's the problem of the commons, you know, like how you don't end up being the last 3 people that don't have fencing, and therefore you're, you know, the stop and shop for all the deer population that remains. In my case, my front yard is Barney Brook, so it's very, you know, I'm very adverse to trying to control access to that. But I'm also aware that if I was ever to try to grow anything nice in my yard again, I would have to fence some of it. So the trade-off is how do I fence it in such a way to allow movement, corridor, you know, wildlife movement that can get to the stream and out of the stream and into the other wooded sections or unwooded sections. But that's going to be a problem that I hope people start thinking about a bit more than just kind of that knee-jerk reaction of let's put up a fence. I'm not speaking about anyone here, but I'm saying that's another possibility that someone's going to say, well, don't call the deer, just put fences up. Won't help the park because it's too expensive for the park, but private property might help. But anyways, I don't know what to say about that except just that it really concerns me as a possible future world as everyone gets fenced up.
One thing, you know, in listening, it gets more and more complicated, and, you know, questions raised by the mayor are all valid, and we're going to do the best we can. But remember, we're working with the volunteers in this room, 1 full-time staff person, and 1 part-time arborist who does more than his share. But we are not the county parks department to gather and to do some of the stuff you're taking. CJ's got 80 other things he's responsible for. So we're going to do our part, but at some time, the committee and us are going to have to decide how far they think we can take it. And then is there another option? Because I don't know if we can do everything on our plate right now. Our job was to make sure you were aware, and I know the mayor's made it sound easy, but I know you were just joking, that there's a deer problem and we can't avoid it. And we keep getting asked by people to help. That's what we're trying to do.
Can I ask if you guys are prepared to, when you come back to us with information and numbers, for that to be at a public meeting?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think this is I've been a member of a few committees now. I've been here in town for 7 years, and I think that we really do have an extraordinary group in the room. I think that they're credible. There's an incredible base of knowledge and a lot of connection to the community. And I strongly support this group being brave, both the board and these committee members, and asking for what we need. I think that what I just heard from Dan is that too little a time won't do anything. We have to address this problem. We're talking about preserving one of the greatest assets of our village. And I, for one, would relish a public meeting. And I would dare anybody to tell us that we haven't considered the problem and looked at it from every angle and are looking out for the best interests of constituents here now, current residents and future ones as well.
I appreciate Francis's comments, but I'd like to see your reaction to what we give you first.
Yeah, sure.
So another comment based on Francis and based on what Dan was saying, you know, how realistic is a 1-year pilot? Now, don't jump on me on this one, but it might be from a biologic environmental perspective, the pilot has to be longer. But I could see a 1-year pilot in the sense of, can we do it safely? You know, and so we sort of softly go into it, but with an understanding that we're probably going to have 2, 3, maybe even 4 years of activity committed to before we can actually analyze the data to a degree that we need to analyze it.
I agree with you, Mark.
So I just think we should go in. So it's not that I'm against the 1-year pilot, but I'm against the idea that, we'll have we have just learned from someone who really should know that it's going to be very hard to get any real data after 1 year. Safety is important. The fact that we could pull it off and that it hasn't negatively impacted the park experience, that's important.
And Larry, do we still have the video from like the 09-10 meetings that we had on this?
I think we have them archived, yeah.
Yeah, because it might be useful for your committee to watch those and talk to the former mayor of Hastings, who basically was.
Run out.
Yeah, and there's actually, I'll actually send the link to you, Joe, you can share it. There's YouTube pages that just attack him about this issue.
Yeah, it's unfortunate.
There's a whole like, a person created a character called something.
Buck Van Deer.
Who's it?
Buck Van Deer.
Buck Van Deer.
Something like that.
And he would do like YouTube presentations ripping the mayor personally, mostly.
He got voted out over it?
No, he didn't get voted out. He eventually just said, I'm not doing this.
Can't do it.
Oh, he got ran out.
Yeah.
Wasn't it mostly from people outside of the village?
A lot of it, but not all of it.
Yeah, they basically got the people in the village, that minority, there's going to be it's going to be very, very unpleasant. It's going to be the most unpleasant thing any of you have gone through in your professional lives, would be my guess.
Swimming pool, 1992.
Yeah, but with blood on your hands. That's going to be the thing.
That's
You're
right.
Murderers.
No,
Well-
you're absolutely right.
So.
What I would say to the objectors is that if your reason for objecting to this is compassion for the deer, think about compassion for all the other species. And if you care about the deer, you care about nature, then, consider caring about all the other species that depend on the ecosystems that we humans have allowed to become unbalanced.
Let's bring wolves back.
What? Wolves,
Let's
yeah.
bring wolves back. That will get a good reaction.
I think what we sometimes forget on any of these issues, that rational thought is typically the last thing that is the most effective thing. It becomes raw emotion, and you can easily have a meeting just go very quickly south on this. So I think that I think your rational thoughts are obviously why I think we're all agreeing to hear the next potential steps. But we're not going to face people going, well, you know what, you're right. I never thought about it, that it's not just the 25 deer we're going to kill, that it's going to protect thousands of other species. It's more like, it's just going to be very emotional.
Right. And the hard part is, though, if you're this group, especially the residents in the room, if you do nothing in 10 years and you see what happened to your woods and your neighbor's property, you're going to probably regret that you weren't willing to stand. And it's so hard for these people to understand, that this could, like you said, it could get really ugly. But what's the choice? Just leave it alone, knowing they don't think that's right?
I think another piece of data, since you're collecting it, is the population growth, because obviously you can't exponentially grow forever. Eventually, it will cap off at some. There's only a maximum sustainable amount of vegetation in the Irvington woods before it's all gone,
Well,
right?
it's in residential properties.
Or in
right?
residential properties. So I think I bet someone's done a study on that if we don't do anything in 10 years, we're going to have 18% more deer based on their extrapolation or something. So I think that's another interesting thing, because I think don't do anything, I think we're near the peak. So if it's your lawn, put a fence around your lawn and put some treatments on it. I think the woods are the one thing you can't. There aren't alternatives to protecting the woods, in my opinion. You can do a lot of things in your yard. They're not all effective either. But it's you get bigger dogs. But it's but I do think that the woods itself is the crucial thing for this, because I think a lot of the arguments, even Lyme disease, which I've been treated for twice, thankfully I'm not suffering from it, but I think that's another piece that gets very emotional. I think that there are alternatives to that are more effective than culling deer. But the what's happening to the woods, I think, is to me the piece of evidence that is you can't deny it. You see it with your eyes. And I think us understanding what happens, the next steps, like, is there some place that this has happened where, now there's only, briar patches in there or something because nothing else grows because they ate it all. I think that those are the type of things that we need to present as well. And I think we've done.
Hold the meeting at Split Rock.
Yeah, there you go. Where the only beer cans and hard seltzers grow.
Well, the other thing, Brian, is that, I mentioned to you and Larry, I think, I don't remember who I mentioned it to, but it was kind of like, the frog in the boiling water. You turn it up slowly over time, the frog doesn't move because it doesn't sense the water is getting to a point that it's going to kill it, because it's so gradual. You go into the woods now, there's a certain state of denudement to the understory, but the trees are still there. So what are you talking about? The real problem is, with storms or with just natural aging, the population starts to go down and there is no regrowth. And, a natural process has incremental regrowth of generations of trees that come up. So, you start, with seedlings, saplings, blah, blah, blah. But we don't see that, and we don't see the tree loss yet, but it's going to be as the trees are lost now. And you said this, everyone said that there is no replacement.
Yeah.
Mark, I'd like to address your comment about fencing. And I think we've already mentioned that my first thought was, well, we should do what, Rockefeller does or what Hastings is proposing and fence the entire woods. Hugely expensive and, at some point that might work. But the reality is what we've chosen to start already in our pilot programs are these exclosures. So the difference between an exclosure and fencing the woods is there's a lot of the woods that it doesn't make sense to fence because the tree canopy is still strong enough that none of this stuff is going to grow. So for a much lower amount of money, you can choose to place your exclosure in a place that doesn't have the canopy, that does have the sunlight, where that big tree just went down last year. And all of a sudden, you're starting to get these other bad grasses growing, the invasive species. You enclose that area and you plant that. We've got good soil. And when we go into those enclosures, we now have sunlight, and we can expect a much higher growth rate with what we are planting in there, than we would if we spent the money to, fence the entire woods. So by targeting specific areas and we already know based on the tree surveys of what types of trees are doing well in what specific sections of our woods, and we can see where the better places to plant will be. That's where we're focused with quote fencing as opposed to the concept of, a homeowner wants to fence their entire property, of course, because they want to grow what plants they want to do wherever they want. But for the health of the woods, we can significantly increase the health of the woods by doing these smaller enclosures in targeted areas, and reducing the general deer population, because if they see this good stuff growing there, they're going to do their best to get in there. So this combination of some culling and targeted enclosures will then, within those enclosures, allow the understory to grow strong enough so at some point we can open those up and make them broader.
My problem is, I understand what you're saying, and conceptually makes sense, but the problem is what we saw already with the numbers of enclosures that were already built. It's less than 1% of the surface area of the park. You're not going to be able to expose enough area to make a difference. I think it is good if you find some really significant areas that maybe the exclosures become bigger for some kind of like a marsh area, or I don't know. I don't know the criteria, but I could see that. But I think trying to get, then it becomes a problem of management again, because you get so many of the little exclosures you've got to maintain for all the fence problems that are going to happen because trees drop branches, trees come over in storms, whatever. So I'm not saying it's not possible, but I'm just saying that there's got to be a balance, and I'm not sure if that's going to be the place where it's most cost effective.
Well, that's why we also need culling, but we've done 1% in a year, basically.
But you haven't maintained more than 1%. I mean, at some point, okay, I mean, it just seems,
Yes, it's going to cost money to maintain it, and it's going to
Yeah.
cost time, but once again, there is no choice. If you want woods, we've got to do it somewhere, and this is a cost-effective way of doing it.
That's what I'm disagree with. I'm not against exclosures, but I think that larger exclosures might actually even be better, but I could be totally wrong. If you have environmental areas, you can, fence 5 acres, for instance, rather than 120 acres. You've got a big bite. I mean, you don't even have more than an acre, and you have how many, 22 exclosures right now?
Correct.
I'm not criticizing, I'm just saying that to me, to make it really effective, you probably want to hit some critical areas and make larger exclosures.
Larger would be better, more would be better. It's
so-
only a question of budget.
Two places I know that tried the bigger exposures,
Good.
Rye and Hastings, both failed.
Really, because it was too much.
Well, Rye fenced in their entire property, and then there was a big storm, and 2 trees took out major sections of the fencing. They paid an enormous amount of money for it, and by the time they got them back up, the deer were all back, and they haven't even tried it again.
That was the Rye Nature Preserve?
Rye Nature Preserve.
Yeah, that's the problem. The deer seem to know where the fence isn't.
Same thing in Hastings,
They tweet it.
Right, and you gotta have the budget to repair, you
Well, you gotta
can't
have
build
the,
the thing.
you gotta have the
and
staff,
let it
because,
go.
right, you have to have the staff, because, you guys are amazing as volunteers. But if you're not there, staff's gotta pick up for it, so it's gotta be manageable for the staff also.
And the one thing, I hear what you're saying, Mark, and I think we can go a little bit bigger than what we're doing now. But if you have one fence over 200 acres, one hole, they all get in. If
I'm
you've
not
got
advocating
30
fencing the
enclosures
park.
and
Yeah.
tree falls on 2 of them, they're only getting in
Yeah.
2, not the other 28.
But I actually do think some of what you're saying is important for the messaging, that we're not saying we're all in on the cull, and this is it, and we're gonna kill 12 deer this year, and we're fixed. I think saying that this is one quiver in the arrow, it's probably a terrible, terrible analogy. But
Finger in the dike.
we're going to work on enclosures. We're going to work on deer-proof plants. We're doing everything we can. This is one piece of the puzzle to bringing the woods back to a healthy state. That's actually even better for the deer. So I think by saying this isn't, I think that's what happened in Hastings. They were all in on their cull. It wasn't even approved by
Birth control.
DEC. No, they were all on the cull first.
Oh, right, oh, yeah.
And they got DEC to approve it, and then they came to actually going to do it. They were going to bait the deer and then use the cattle bolt, and they didn't. And then they went all in on the immunocontraception, and that just was like
But
that was like throwing
they did do some branding, because one of their deer were found in Tarrytown.
on the prowl.
Sorry, CJ, you were gonna try to say something.
Yes, Mr. Allen, and I just wanted to build off your great question and what Dave was talking to. Part of those 22 exclosures that we put up in the woods from this past year, they do focus on the diversity of ecosystems within the woods. Like Hermit's wetland is entirely, at least the part with the manageable Phragmites has now been exclosed within an exclosure, and so looking at, as Dave pointed out, looking at areas where we can essentially get in to set up an exclosure to almost as like a nursery.
Right.
Just wanted to share that, and that goes kind of into the conversations that the Woods Committee had with Peter and I, kind of in our brainstorming as to where we're putting the exclosures, the research on the tree index that's from our work and Miguel's work to look at kind of the potential seed bank that might already be there and how these smaller exclosures that could potentially serve as nursery.
Are we seeing a budget for exclosures at some point? Expansion, not, for.
We do have money in the budget to keep putting some of the smaller sizes up, yes. We
And
do not have money for a major one.
And maintaining them, of course.
And well, maintaining means as long as you give me a staff person, or give us a staff
Well,
person,
yeah.
we will maintain it. And as long as the volunteers don't go away. Here's another important part of this, is that this group deserves enormous credit for rejuvenating the teen community and what they're doing in the woods and their passion for the woods and the work they're doing. CJ had 7 out there again this weekend doing barberries. I'm not sure what Dan meant when he said we don't have a barberry problem. I think Zoe and I were staring each other down when he said that. So I don't think we could have hit 4,000 barberries. But the kids feel it. They're part of it now. And we're trying to make them, because let's face it, 10 years from now, if one of them became inspired to be the one who starts the lead or is in front of you talking about stuff like this, that's really important. And we need to let them see we're representing what's important to the woods, which is another challenge for us as this gets tougher.
And I just want to mention again, Zoe's work with youth on galvanizing that invasives removal project.
Great.
Yay.
All right.
Just wondering if there are any more questions, including whether Trustee Bard has any comments or questions?
Nikki, your mic.
I don't have any specific, I guess I do have a question. I was reluctant to ask questions because I had to come late, which I think the board knows. The meeting was supposed to be yesterday, and when it was asked to switch to today, I had an important meeting, and I in deference to Trustee Lonke, agreed to switch, knowing that I would be late. So I mean no disrespect at all by being late to this meeting. It was planned in the scheduling of the move in the scheduling from Monday to Tuesday. So I'm reluctant to ask questions that might have been addressed before I got on. So I guess forgive me, but I'm going to ask them now anyway. Did anyone address the idea of sending a hunter into the woods? The effect that will have on other people in the woods at the time, the safety issues of other people being hurt, the issue of having to watch this. Imagine a mom and kids going for a nice walk in the woods and having to watch, a deer be shot and bleeding and, and be carted off or whatever. I mean, I have to admit that the idea of sending a hunter into our woods is disturbing.
It's a very good question, Mitch. First of all, the hunting would not be, CJ, explain the areas that we most likely would target.
We can,
Dan can answer that question.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'd have left.
Yes, safety is very important.
It's the most important.
All right, and can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So when I have a multifaceted answer for you. So one of the first things is that archery is going to be the safest method that you could use for harvesting deer. One of the reasons why is because you'd be using elevated tree stands, in which case the arrow is projected always down towards the ground. Archery is silent, so it's unnoticeable. And then also the hunters, when they're shooting at deer, they're not shooting very far. The arrow as a projectile isn't going far like a bullet would. And typically they're harvesting deer somewhere between like 20 and 30, maybe sometimes maximum like 40 yards. The way that the equipment works is that there's a sight on the bow that has small little pins on it, and you have to have the animal in that sight picture and that pin over the location where you want that arrow to go. So there's not the mishaps of like randomly firing far off into the distance or anything like that. Westchester County is restricted to bow. But even if we had an option down here, a lot of the management programs would be probably sticking to bow because of the public use of these properties. If you look at any of the management programs in the county, and I'm not talking about county run ones, I'm just talking about in Westchester County in general, to my knowledge, every single one of them keeps their trails open to the public. There have been no incidences where anybody from the public has been harmed. And I checked with the state last year, I think, and amongst archery and bow hunters and the public, nobody's been nobody's been harmed by mistake, through archery. Like nobody mistakenly shot somebody or anything like that. So archery itself is very safe. Going to your question about people viewing the hunters or watching deer be harvested, somebody who's working the property to harvest deer, they don't want to be where there's a lot of people, because that means that the deer aren't there either. So they're going to be in areas where people aren't and where deer are. And therefore, you shouldn't see a hunter that is hunting. In our programs, the only time that the public ever come across hunters is on their way into the woods or when they're on their way out of the woods, because they share the same trails. And we've had some parks that someone would call me and be like, "Oh, I can't believe you have a hunting program here." And I would say, like, "Well, how long have you been hiking there?" And if they mentioned something that it was, within the last 13 years that they just simply didn't notice that our programs were taking place. And it's because that's the way that the hunting and the management works, is there's no real reason to run into a hunter if they're hunting in a way that is discreet, and they're effective at harvesting deer, because they're nowhere near the public to begin with. So archery as a method is very safe for the public. It's very quiet and usually goes unseen. Like I said, at least for our programs, the only time someone from the public would come across a hunter is not while they're actively hunting, but it's only on their, through their access and when they're departing, that they might, view them with their equipment or whatever like that.
When you mean departing, you mean carrying a dead deer?
Well, in those particular, I meant departing, like every hunt that you go on doesn't necessarily mean that you're harvesting a deer on every hunt, right? So you're going into the woods and then you're leaving the woods. It's like going to work during the day and then you go home at the end of the day. So there's usually more of that than deer coming out of the woods these days. As for, and to answer your question, as for what happens when deer are harvested on our properties, we haven't had any public pushback about deer being seen, like harvested deer being seen, but we're also trying to be very discreet about it. So in like some cases, for example, if we have the deer on the cart, we'll throw a tarp over it. It's obvious there's a deer under there, but it's not something that's very visible. What we found over time, though, is that the public, at least that were using our properties, were more interested in learning about the deer and learning about management and learning about like the biological samples that I was collecting off of those deer carcasses than they were offended by it. So it is something to consider. Safety, I would say that you're 100% okay on. If you're worried about the public coming across deer that are harvested, that would be something that you could work with. If you go in the direction of having somebody like an archer to harvest deer, that is something that you could work with them.
Is there anything you can say about time of day, Dan?
Yeah, it depends on the property and what kind of pressures those animals are under and what their activity patterns are. And activity patterns can change due to a various number of different effects. So, currently, I think someone had mentioned that the deer are occupying the property during the daytime. And if I were to take a wild guess, it's because they're using the property as refugia during the day, and then they're feeding on the lawns and the gardens at night. So that's why they're so visible there during the day. There's not a lot of cover for them in there, and there's not a lot of food resources, so there's not really any other reason for them to be in there, except for essentially a place to kind of hang out before and stage before they're feeding on private properties. That's, once again, that's just a guess. I haven't studied these particular animals down there. Those patterns can change based on availability of food resources, what they are, where they're located, and then especially due to pressure. So pressure being, human impact, whether it be hunting or just people hiking and use of the property, or some other sort of pressure where the deer just don't feel comfortable during a certain time of day and therefore vacate it and then might come back later at a different time. So I guess your question was probably moving in the direction of what would be the best time if you were to hunt the property, what would be the best time of day to do that? It depends on what the deer are doing. So that could be in the mornings. It can be in the later afternoons.
Thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions?
Mitch, anything else?
Questions? I guess I really don't have any other questions. No, thank you.
All right, well, thanks for all your hard work so far. We look forward to hearing from you all soon.
Can I just ask I know CJ and Joe, you're working with Joanna Paul. Can we just make an announcement about the event on the 16th?
Sure. Joanna Paul, who's a student who's working directly with the Green Policy Task Force, approached CJ and I and asked if we would help her to coordinate a run to raise money to buy native plants for locations in Irvington, including the high school property. She's a lovely young girl who really wants to do a good job, so we've met with her several times. In fact, did we lock in a time for tomorrow?
Yes, it's going to be after school.
So tomorrow will be our last meeting. We're meeting her. We put the facility request with her with the school district. So it's our program, which gives her access to everything we have. CJ's going to be there to help her run it. She's got about 10 students that are going to help her be on the trails. We set the course up for her. It's a great, another teen initiative and someone who's working hard to not only help us, but the Green Policy Task Force. It's going to be this Sunday afternoon. They're meeting up on the East Field, and the race is between 2 and 3 o'clock. It's open to everyone, and there's no fee, but
there is a fee.
Oh, there is a fee.
Well, it's just a $10 donation.
Donation, right. We're going to give her a donation box.
Okay. And then are you able to do like a QR code for people who can't make it to donate? Will you be able to do that?
Look at Larry for that, or CJ.
Yeah, whatever.
Okay.
We can do donation.
Okay. So she just needs some help with the flyer, just to make sure.
We'll make sure they go through that tomorrow.
Thank you.
She's a keeper, that young lady.
I assume she's got to go away to
Yeah.
college.
Then we'll get it back.
Maybe she's one of the ones who comes back.
There you go.
Thank you.
I will make a motion to adjourn if I can have a second.
Yeah.
All in favor?
Thank you for all
Thank you very
the
much.
volunteers in this room.
Yes, thank you all.